In this video, we're going to look at some basics of grid and how this works. So grid is used to organize the content on your page, do some layout here in a grid format. So if you can look at, I have opened this in Firefox Developer Edition. There's an advantage to using this to show you your grid. I'm going to show you, this is how it looks originally before we've done anything to it, just basic cards in a stack here. When I look at the index and the CSS here, you can see in the index I have a UL with a class of cards, and I have list items, and that's what contains the text that's in there. I've already styled it using the page.css file. I'm just going to do grid in the style.css file. When you're working on your own sites, then that can all be combined into one CSS file, but for example's sake, then it's easier if it's just simplified into one, or into separate CSS files. So similar to how Flexbox works, we have to tell in the CSS what the parent, we have to define it that we're going to use grid. So our class of cards is the parent element here, so it's on the UL, which is the parent of all these list items and these individual cards. So I'm going to say display grid here, and then I have to set, I'm going to set columns here. So I can set grid template columns, and I'm going to say these are each one fraction, and that will create 3 equal columns taking up 1 fraction of the available space. So when I reload this, then I see that there's 3 columns for my 5 cards. They each take up an equal amount. Even as I shrink down, they're going to adjust together. You can play around with this. I could set this middle column to be 2 fractions. So this will take up 2 fractions of the available space, making it bigger than the other cards. You can set explicit widths on these. So if I set these at 200 pixels, they would stay 200 pixels, and the center one would adjust. So in this one, when I refresh, grabbed the wrong application. So when I refreshed here, then see, even as this gets smaller, these are going to stay at 200 pixels. This is the one that's going to adjust to meet the available space, because that's what's left over and it's working within its the required space. So there's a little bit of kind of margin and stuff that's going on here. So if we want to build in some margin, there's a command. So you can do individually, you can do grid row gap. So if we set that at 10 pixels, and we could do grid row grid column gap here at 25 pixels. Save that here, and you can see that that builds in space. If you want them to be of equal size, then grid gap is the shorthand here. So you can just say grid gap of 20 pixels, which will account for all the space around it. So now they have an equal margin around the columns and the rows here. So this is the basics of it. So we established, I can go back to how I had this originally. We've established how many columns we want and what the width is, and we've put in a gap around the rows and columns to give it some margin.